Hello and welcome to my very first game discussion video. To make things clear from the very beginning, I am not qualified enough to provide you with professional critique of any kind. This is just my thoughts and feelings on the matter. I find it incredibly difficult to even talk about the subject at hand, let alone review it. So there's going to be a lot of rambling here, which I apologize in advance for. The game in question is Fragile Dreams Farewell Ruins of the Moon. For a quick recap, this is a game developed by Bandai Namco and released exclusively on Nintendo Wii in 2010. The game's premise is as follows. The world has faced its end, and the overwhelming majority of humanity has been wiped out. You play as a young boy who navigates the desolate post-apocalyptic city of Tokyo in search of other survivors. That was simple, wasn't it? Well, describing what this game actually is way more difficult than to simply explain what it's about. To be perfectly honest, I'm not even sure I know what exactly Fragile Dreams is, but of course I'll try my best to unravel this mystery item for you. I've watched a plethora of videos of this game, and while opinions on it are rather varied, one thing that stands out in particular to me is that people seem to have misconceptions going into it. I know it's certainly confused some people, and I myself have been trying to wrap my head around how to even approach discussing this game for quite some time now. And I think I know how to give you an idea of what it's all about. I think. I'm sure there are countless interpretations of this game, so keep in mind that this is just my take on it. The first thing you need to know about Fragile Dreams is that it's not a horror game. Do not expect a horror game going into it. This is one of the most common mistakes people seem to make. It is true it has some horror elements. The combat is clunky and the majority of the enemy encounters is completely optional. Enemies do hit hard and most of the time it makes much more sense to just run past them. Plus you have a limited inventory that you can't just litter with healing items because you need as much space as possible for the items you find along the way. However, those are the only things in the game that are reminiscent of classic survival horror. Outside of the combat, I struggle to attribute anything in Fragile Dreams to this genre. It doesn't even attempt to scare you. There are no jump scares, no ambience. Nothing tries to distress you in the ways that horror games usually do. And you shouldn't expect that because it says it right here on the front cover that this isn't a mature title. Well then, you might ask, if this isn't a horror game, then what is it? Well, I don't believe Fragile Dreams belongs to any specific game genre, not exclusively to one and not the other anyway, so we need to make a comparison. You know how cooking in Breath of the Wild works? You come up to a cooking pot, select a bunch of different ingredients from your inventory, and toss them in all at once. This is how I imagine the actual development of this game to have been. It's just completely random ideas thrown into the mix with no recipe whatsoever. Modern day Tokyo in ruins? Okay. Classic survival horror combat? Fine. Baby stealth segments? Can't say no to that. Level up system? Yeah, sure, why not? Ghosts? Okay. Giant animals? Sure. Robots? Of course. How can we manage without robots? If you were to ask me what kind of monstrous meal this concoction would be in Breath of the Wild, I'd say the monster cake. The vanilla one, the one that only consists of 4 ingredients. It's cool. It serves no function. It's just an oddity that exists for some reason. The vanilla monster cake only restores like 3/4 of a heart, I think. It's really not useful at all. And that is a very good parallel you can draw to Fragile Dreams. Again, functionally. It has elements of so many different genres, and yet it doesn't commit to any of those genres fully. But it's not really a bad thing. I don't think. It's harmless, inoffensive. Much like the monster cake, it just exists. If only so that we could feast our eyes upon it and wonder what kind of mad scientist created it. And if it sounds like I'm being harsh on the game, I have to say, this is probably the most beautiful Frankenstein monster I've ever laid my eyes on. From everything I've said so far, you can probably already guess what this game's whole deal is. I think it's pretty obvious that when making it, the developer didn't have the intention of creating a video game. They wanted to create an experience. That is why it's so difficult to talk objectively about it. If you're gonna judge it by the same merits as any other game, it wouldn't be wrong, but it wouldn't be fair. And I want to be fair to Fragile Dreams, because I do believe that this is something very, very special. If there's one thing that it does commit to, it has to be its premise. It's been a couple of decades, it seems, since the apocalypse. Everything's covered in grass, all the buildings are run down and partially in ruins even, and in this empty, dying world, you are seemingly all alone. As the main protagonist Seto puts it, all the people he thought he saw slipped away like they were just a mirage. His only family, the old man he used to live with, passes away at the very end of Seto's 50th summer. From that moment on, he becomes completely by himself. That is when the game begins. You search the place you used to call your home for any potential important things the old man left behind, and shortly afterwards set out to look for other survivors, if there were indeed any. This wonderfully melancholic premise is what I believe to be the game's strongest aspect. It's a game about loneliness, seclusion, sorrow, regret, and ultimately life and death. And I know what you're probably thinking. Please don't mistake Fragile Dreams for some sort of cringy emo BS. You're playing as a kid. He might be 15, but he's clearly still a child, free from teenage angst and all the overblown fatalism that comes with it. The game's narrative is presented through his innocent, fragile view of the world, and there's nothing pretentious or superficial about it. Yes, things Seto says are often naive, yes, he might appear incredibly dumb at certain points, and yes, he's a little crybaby and there'll be plenty of tears on your journey. That's alright though, because that's what kids are like. If you really can't stand children, you won't enjoy his company, so keep that in mind. Also, the English voice acting tends to deviate a little from what the character is supposed to sound like. The Japanese voiceover, which is thankfully included as an option in the game, definitely suits Seto better. The English Seto sounds a bit more mature, and as such less believable in my opinion. Although, the acting itself is pretty good. Okay, we've established the premise. Humanity has been mysteriously erased from the face of the planet, but you're somehow still alive. What do you do in the game? Well, you're navigating the ruined landscapes of Tokyo, of course. There aren't that many locations to talk about, so I don't want to spoil too much, but a lot of the time you're somewhere underground. Usually you're given fairly large chunks of the map to explore. You run around and perform various tasks according to your current objective, which most of the time is just finding the exit or pursuing something. You also collect a myriad of different things, including key items and weapons, and of course you fight enemies along the way. This is where it gets interesting. There are normal enemies in the game, like starving dogs and flocks of very, very angry ravens. Don't laugh, they're pretty deadly. But the most common enemies you're going to encounter are ghosts, or at least that's how Seto refers to them. These creatures are in fact physical manifestations of human thoughts. Yes, you're getting attacked by thoughts. How more relatable can a video game be? Yeah, but there's this Silent Hillish aspect to these enemies in that you can read into their designs and surmise what they could possibly represent. I personally never dug too much into that, but certain enemy types I felt strongly implied there was some specific meaning behind them. Fighting these things rewards you with XP and levels you up, which increases your overall HP and attack power. I don't know how I feel about these baby RPG elements. This isn't an RPG.
not a well-designed one anyway. Not only can you skip the majority of the enemy encounters and still beat any boss without grinding, which, yes, there are bosses in the game for some reason, but also I feel like it contradicts with that survival horror element of the combat. You could refuse to engage with the enemy and risk getting killed in a more dangerous encounter ahead, which I have to say does build a little bit of tension, or you could fight every enemy that stands in your way, level up quicker and get out of any combat scenario relatively unscathed, except when you're up against birds. Birds will own you either way. The game juggles these two elements without any solid middle ground, and again, I'm not sure whether it's bad or not. In theory, you can play it the way you want. You want to play it like a survival horror game? You can. You want to play it like an action RPG? You can. The problem is, neither of these things is fleshed out. You have a survival horror combat in a game that isn't scary, and you have RPG elements that aren't realized to any degree of complexity.
This is Fragile Dreams in a nutshell. It's a mix of different things that kind of work together, but not really. And that's because everything in the game is designed around its premise. Not the other way around, where you create a functional skeleton first and then put meat on its bones. It's like a Nopon. As in, I've got no goddamn idea how it's structured. I don't even know if these allegories work or not, I'm so sorry.
Now, you might have noticed how all this time I've been saying the word premise a lot. Premise, not story. The reason for that is the story really isn't all that great, at least as far as the plot itself goes. It's just a bunch of different things that happen to set on his journey. They're all completely separate from one another, none of them intertwined to create any sort of grander narrative. There are no character arcs that develop as time passes, and there's a lot of running around between story moments, some of which also feel very disjointed and poorly handled. Every major plot point gets its own summary cutscene where adult Seto reflects upon what happened to him back then and how it affected him, but you don't really feel the impact of those moments as the game goes on. When seemingly important to him events occur, you'd think he would at least keep saying something about that later on, or the game would make some subtle references to his previous experiences here and there, but none of it is ever brought up again. You can only sit there and imagine what Seto thinks or feels at any given moment. The truth of the matter is, the game's actual plot isn't all that involving. You run around for substantial chunks of time and then some story happens. Maybe. Which is very disappointing because the first half of the game is very engaging. There are legitimately interesting things happening, but then you can't help but notice how the amount of unique content diminishes and the amount of plain running increases.
But thankfully not everything's that grim. There are moments in the game where the story shines. And when I say shines, I mean shines really, really brightly. I'm talking about, of course, the mementos.
Throughout your journey, you'll come across a great deal of the so-called mystery items. Those items are concealed in some sort of packaging and can't be viewed or used right away. You need to bring them to one of the many campfires scattered around the world, which act as save points, where you restore your HP, manage your inventory, and of course unwrap the mysterious objects you've been collecting and carrying around. Some of them turn out to be various healing items and weaponry that you haven't come across before. Next time you stumble upon them, they'll be usable right there and then. The other ones are the mementos I mentioned. Those are all different objects that belong to unnamed people who died in the wake of the apocalypse. When Seto unravels one at a campfire, you are presented with a story related to its past owner.
These stories are brilliant.
Some of them are short and contain brief monologues or summaries of some events, and the other ones are so large they had to be split into parts and tied to different objects. Regardless of their length, they're all filled to the brim with emotion. Be it fear, sorrow, regret or despair, they describe the feelings of all those people when they realized they were going to die. And it's beautiful.
I scaled that hill in these dirty shoes. But if this is what reality holds, I'd rather have never known. I'd be happy climbing this hill, never knowing anything, no real summit, an endless mound of earth. Nothing, nothing at all. No hill, nothing ever there. Not even my birth. No value. No reason to live. No reason to even die. This prayer without answer from a God who never even existed.
Some of them also focus more on personal drama. One story stands out to me in particular, and it's the one about two school kids, a girl who dreamed of becoming a ballerina and a boy who strived to achieve great heights as a scientist.
The way they ended that story, it was great. And you know, some of these stories, they left an impression on me. They left me thinking about things that I never questioned or even realized about what it's like to live knowing you're about to die any moment now. About how much we could have achieved if we took the presented opportunities. About what will happen to the things we hold dear after we're gone, and whether or not they were actually all that important to us. Again, I think it's beautiful.
And that's ultimately what I find so special about Fragile Dreams. This game made me just stop for a moment and wonder about something I probably shouldn't be bothered by all that much at my age. Remember what I said about the monster cake? You can add one more ingredient to that recipe and it'll change its properties. You can greatly enhance its usefulness by adding something hearty to the mix, for instance. That one final ingredient can change it all, and the thought-provoking nature of Fragile Dreams is exactly that for me. It's something that makes this meal so much more inviting. It's still a monster cake, sure, it still isn't really supposed to be a thing, but there's just something about it that is so appealing to me. Despite all of its clumsy attempts at being a video game, it captivated me in a way a rare game ever does. Yes, its gameplay is alright at best. Yes, its storytelling isn't really all that engaging. And yes, through the sheer amount of all the different things they put into the game, you can't but be astonished by how much wasted potential there is there.
And still I think I like it. I don't think I've ever felt this conflicted about a video game before. What it all comes down to is, if you're gonna go into it expecting a video game, I imagine you'll be left rather disappointed. Because it's not that it's a video game that matters. I want to recommend Fragile Dreams as an experience you can have. Watching someone's Let's Play of it could give you an idea of what it's like, but actually exploring this ruined world and seeing everything with your own eyes, reading all the notes by the campfire and admiring this beautiful giant moon in the sky by yourself while soaking in this wonderful atmosphere of seclusion is something I'd say is worth experiencing by actually playing it.
With that being said though, I still struggle to end my recommendation with a definitive buy/don't buy line, because at the end of the day, whether you enjoy it or not depends solely on what kind of person you are. Even the most commended of dishes can turn out to be not to your taste.
And that's where I think I'll leave it. I'm glad Fragile Dreams is something I got to experience. If I had to summarize my opinion of it, I'd say it certainly has a lot of artistic value to it, and its themes and atmosphere definitely make up for its somewhat lackluster gameplay offerings. I know not everybody will feel the same way, but that's where I stand. And in the end, I may still not completely know what it is and who it's for, and ultimately whether it's good or bad, but I'm 100% positive that Fragile Dreams Farewell Ruins of the Moon deserves a place in my game shelf.